Hello, Sky here. This is now my 6th time recording this intro. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time getting these words out. So hopefully by having named that, it will be smooth sailing from here. Welcome to the podcast. I'm happy to be here. I'm really excited about this interview that I have to share with you all with Margeaux. The conversation is so potent. I just love Margeaux. I love the way that she looks at the world, and she is so kindly shared with us some of her stories and experiences around chronic illness and poverty and restorative justice and just what it means to navigate life in her body. And I felt really nourished by the conversation, and I hope that you will too. But first, I have some news for you. So let's do the little intro thing and then get into it. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Okay, the news is I am delighted to share that Worthy Women Rise is halfway full. We have about a week and a half left. Doors close August 26th, and we have limited spots available for this nourishing year-long container of healing and exploration that will allow you to get to the root of your worthiness wound so you can take up greater space, cultivate emotional mastery, and just feel more you in the world. And so in honor of spots being taken up and doors closing in a week and a half, I thought I would share with you an IGTV that I recorded about how to heal the worthiness wound. This is a question I get a lot. Of course I do. I teach about the worthiness wound. Of course I'm going to get questions of how to heal it. And so I want to plug in this audio here for you all and that shares my thoughts on the exact steps that I take to support myself in healing the worthiness wound and now teach in Worthy Women Rise. The reason why I'm always so tender in responding to this question is because I see the healing of a worthiness wound as a process. I don't think we can do like one thing and your worthiness wound will be eradicated, because the way I look at the worthiness wound, it's an emotional wound. And it is, a set of core beliefs about our understanding of the world generated from a very early age, surrounded by really complex emotions like shame, guilt, disgust, embarrassment, etc. And so just changing our mindset won't necessarily do that. And while it's important to create different patterns in your life and different behaviors in your life, and that is a really important part of healing the worthiness wound, it's not the whole thing. We also have to process some of that emotional gunk. We've got to get that out. And so I want to share my process with you today to give you an idea of what you can expect in my group program, Worthy Women Rise, because this is the process that I teach, but also as an opportunity for you to think about your own healing and how you may incorporate some of these aspects into your life. So there's first like the foundational modules that I teach. The first 3 modules are kind of the foundation that sets us up for the rest of the program. The first module being cultivating space, the second being relationship with our body, and the third being a relationship with our emotions. In order for us to do this work, we have to have space to do it. And that means physical space, emotional space. We have to start to clear stuff out. So many of us have packed our schedules to the brim, packed our houses, just packed our lives so that we don't have to feel, so that we don't have to be with what's really uncomfortable. And so it's important to create that space and then start to cultivate the capacity to be with the really uncomfortable things that come up in our bodies. I love somatic work. I think that there's a lot of healing in somatic work. I think that we are all so disconnected from our bodies, and it is so important for our nervous system for us to bring ourselves into a space of home with our bodies in order for us to do this work. And then the third module, one of my most favorite modules, is a relationship with our emotions. How do we develop a healthy relationship with our emotions? This has been really difficult for me in my journey because I've been indoctrinated and taught that I'm too much. My emotions are too much. I'm too expressive. I need to dim it down. I need to bring it in. My anxiety is too much for people. And so learning how to be with my emotions after 20 years of pushing it away is a whole vibe, is a whole thing. Once we have that foundation, we start to learn some tools, some branches of how we can sink into those spaces a little bit more deeply. We talk about reparenting. How do we cultivate a relationship with our inner child? How do we become mothers to ourselves in ways that we never had as a child and start to meet those needs? Ancestry, how do we connect to the land and our ancestors and ground ourselves in what is real instead of what is appropriative and taking from somebody else? And pleasure, how do we access pleasure principles in our lives? How do we access the capacity to experience joy, play, creativity, intuition? All of that is necessary for shadow work, right? All of that is necessary to come with us. We can't do this deep dive into our pain if we don't have a real spaciousness to experience pleasure. Okay, so then the next layer is we move out into the macro. It's really important for me to talk about systemic oppression. This is a whole module in Worthy Women Rise where we talk about the intersections of different oppressive identities. We all carry marginalized and oppressed identities. And so understanding both how we are the oppressor and we are the marginalized is really important in knowing how to create a sense of worthiness that is grounded in what is true, what is real, what is ours, rather than on power dynamics that are systemic and we may be inadvertently participating in and causing harm to others. We can't create a real grounded sense of worth if we're not recognizing our privileges and the ways that we may be harming others, yeah? Taking a space that isn't ours to take up. Okay, so then we start getting into the relationship. What does it look like to be in thriving relationships with other people? What is boundaries, communication, attachment? What does that all mean? How can we tune our nervous system into a co-regulatory space where we get to be with other humans and allow our relationship with other humans to deepen our relationship with self? This is really hard. My biggest challenge in my life has been in my interpersonal relationships, and odds are I feel like yours probably are too, because it's so important for us to have a really thriving relationship with others. But how do we do that? So that's what we talk about in those modules. And then we get into worth and we get into the worthiness wound. Now that we've had an ample foundation where we can really start to understand developmental psychology, what has happened in our childhood, how can we grieve the parents that we've never had, how can we reparent ourselves, we have all these tools, we have deeper access to our intuition. Now we get to really go into the worthiness round. And so that's an interesting way that I teach the worthiness round, right? Is that it tends to be towards the middle to the end of the program. Why do I do it that way? Because so much of what we believe to be true about ourselves is playing out and is coming from a worthiness wound and is playing out. And the more that we can start to see it outside of ourselves, we get to see how it's playing out, the more we get to then heal our worthiness wound without self-annihilation, without thinking that we're bad, we're wrong, we're broken. Cultivating self-awareness and the capacity to be with the insights that we develop without self-annihilation is really critical to healing our deeper wounds. We can't just go straight into the wound. It's not how that works. And anyone who tells you that they can transform your pain like that, they're lying to you. They're leaving you dysregulated, discombobulated, and not able to integrate it into your life. Fast, deep is not always the answer. We will go deep, but we will go slow. We will go carefully. We will consider your entire psychology in the process. That's why I talk about the worthiness wound later on in the program. Okay, so I listed out here, I wrote down 5 things that can be really helpful in thinking about getting into a different relationship with your worthiness wound. First, it's really important that you believe that it's possible for you. You believe that you're not that special, right? Like, you're special. I say this to my clients all the time. You're so special. Like, you're so unique and different and amazing and spacious. And I just love the uniqueness of each individual human that I get to be with. But we're all also having a common human experience. Our brains, our psychology, the way that we understand the world is unique to us and our lived experience, but also parallels so many other people's experiences. And so if I've seen that it's possible for hundreds of women that I've worked with, it's possible for you. There's no such thing as being too broken. There's no such thing as being too far gone. I've worked with women in their 20s. I've worked with women in their 50s and 60s. There is no such thing as being way too broken to do this work. Truly not. And so believing that it is possible for you, trusting that this is possible for you, even if you don't know how, that's okay. We don't need to know how. But just believing that it is possible for you is a really important first step. Then the next really important step is to become aware of when the worthiness wound appears. So starting to really see how often in your life the worthiness wound is speaking to you. How often do you notice yourself taking actions from the worthiness wound? How often do you notice the inner critic telling you that you are feeling unworthy? That is really important and helpful, because the more that you can measure that, the more that you can see where it is happening in your life, the more we can start to create patterns. I'm a master at breaking patterns. I love pattern breaking. And in order for us to break patterns, we have to become really aware of how the pattern is shaping up in our lives. What do you do that leads to the worthiness wound feeling the loudest? What is the experience in your life of when the worthiness wound is the loudest? It's important for us to get a really clear picture of what's happening before we can go in. Okay, and then the third is to expand your capacity to feel unworthy without believing that it's true. So in order for us to heal the worthiness wound, we have to allow ourselves to feel inadequate. And I know that that's mind-boggling, because everything about the coaching industry tells you that you have to focus on feeling the good shit. That's not shadow work. Shadow work, which is the real work, which is the only work that really matters and creates the real lasting change, requires us to cultivate the capacity to be with our discomfort, to be with our most cruddy, yucky feelings without making it mean that there's something wrong with us. Can you feel shame? Can you feel disgust, resentment, anger? Can you feel brokenness? Can you feel unworthy without making it mean then that you are? Because just because you feel something doesn't mean that that's true. So how can we let ourselves increase the capacity to be with our worthiness wound, to feel unworthy without then making it mean and have all these stories about what it means that leads you into this cycle of overwhelm and shame and then self-annihilation and comparatitis, and then you commit that tomorrow you're going to be better and you're going to wake up and you're going to go to the gym, and then you start this really rigid life structure because you think that's the answer to never feeling broken again. You do it for a week and then you don't anymore, and then you feel shitty and the spiral starts all over again. I know it's so tempting to create these really rigid rules when we're trying to heal stuff like this, but that's not the answer. There's a different way. Okay. Number 4, get curious as to what unmet need your worthiness wound is asking of you. Because if there's a worthiness wound really loud, there's probably an unmet need underneath. There's probably something going on underneath that is not being felt, that is not being attuned to, that is not being recognized. So when you can increase your capacity to be with the worthiness wound without pulling away, right, then we can be like, okay, I'm here. What am I really needing? What is my worthiness wound trying to communicate to me? Yeah, okay, I feel inadequate, but why? What's underneath? What's happening here that's leading me to believe that I am inadequate? Getting curious, getting into it, really giving ourselves permission to feel it in our bodies is so critical. And then number 5, tend to those needs unapologetically while reparenting your inner child. So now that you have unmet needs, it's important to tend to them. Maybe it's neglect. Maybe you've been neglecting yourself, your physical needs. Maybe you've been neglecting your emotional needs. Maybe you're feeling disconnected. Maybe you're feeling alone. Whatever those feelings are, maybe you're feeling, let down, disappointed. Disappointment is such a hard feeling to feel. So whatever the feeling is, whatever the unmet need is, maybe you need rest or to eat. Maybe you need to reach out, get support, not feel alone. Whatever is coming up for you, meeting that need, giving that to yourself is a way of reparenting ourselves, right? Is a way of saying to ourselves, you're worthy, you're significant, and I believe in you, and you deserve to have your needs met. And so tending to those unmet needs, giving ourselves permission to have those needs, all of that is so, so, so important. So everyone is different. These steps are really oversimplified. Everything that I offer on Instagram has to be oversimplified because the way that I teach, the way that I love to do my work is in the context of a human's life. And that's why in Worthy Women Rise, I have weekly coaching calls. We're going to become such a close family of being together every single week so that you can be understood in the context of your life and be given support within your experience instead of just kind of having these vast frameworks and not knowing how to relate it specifically to your lived experience. That's why I love this program so much. It's so intimate, it's delightful, and it leads to real change. So if you're interested in learning more about Worthy Women Rise, you can go to worthywomenrise.com. Spaces are filling up. We only have limited spaces available. Doors close August 26th and we get started August 30th. And if you're listening to all of this and you're like, okay, I have some ideas of like what I can start to implement and make changes in my life, wonderful. Just the fact that you're thinking that means that you're already believing that it's possible for you. And that's the first step. That's the most important step of all. Believe that this is available for you, that you are worthy of feeling worthy. Just believe that. You don't have to feel it. It doesn't have to be like a body knowing yet. You just have to have a slight idea that it is possible for you. And I'm telling you, I've been doing this work for 10 years. I have yet to see someone who's completely inaccessible, right? Who's like so far gone. We are all capable of developing a delightfully healthy relationship with our worthiness wound. It is possible for you. And the more that you continue to do this inner work, doing the shadow work, really tending to the broken places within you, the more you're going to just fly. For me personally, every single time in every single year that I've tended to the worthiness wound, my capacity to take up space, to be seen in my business, to be asking for what I want, to be in a really intimate relationship with my partner, to navigate complexities and conflict without it completely shutting down my system. All of that has been available for me the more I continue to do this work. It's a beautiful journey, and I'm so honored to be on it with you. Let me know if you have any questions or any thoughts about this video, and I'll talk to you soon. There you have it, a super simplified, high-level idea of how I begin to heal the worthiness wound. Like I said, everybody is different. Everybody has different experiences with the worthiness wound. And often when I'm coaching women in Worthy Women Rise, I'd let them know, like, listen, I'm going to give you some thoughts on this, and then I'm going to give the next person the complete opposite thoughts, because the two of you are on totally different journeys. What may work for one person may not work for the other person. It may not be relevant to the other person, or the exact opposite is what they need to explore or play or dial into in their lives. And that's why I am so tender about talking about the how. But I will say that if you are listening to this and you're like, okay, this is resonating with me, like I feel like, I'm ready to really start to take this place within my heart seriously and heal the space so that I can finally move on with my life. I don't have to be continually debilitated by this for the rest of my life. If you're feeling that way, you may be a good candidate for Worthy Women Rise. You can learn more by going to worthywomenrise.com. Like I said, doors close August 26th or when all of the spots are taken up. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. You can email me at info@thaissky.com. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this cohort. It's going to be such a powerful year-long experience. I'm really ready to create a 2021 with you all. Yay. Okay. Let's bring on my interview with Margeaux. Here is Margeaux's bio. Margeaux Feldman is a writer, educator, and community builder living on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Canada. Margeaux identifies as a cisgender, queer femme, sick babe, and trauma babe from a working class poor family. She's currently completing her PhD in English literature and sexual diversity studies. Her creative and academic writing looks at complex trauma, chronic illness, and intimacy, and she's been published in various literary magazines and academic journals. She regularly facilitates workshops on topics ranging from trauma-informed conflict resolution, boundary work, and community grief work to anti-oppressive, trauma-informed pedagogy in higher education. Margeaux is a Cancer Sun, Sagittarius Rising, and Aries Moon, which she translates into #0chill. I love that about her. I love that. Okay, so in this conversation with Margeaux, I want you to be thinking about your own relationship with money, your own relationship with body, your own relationship with trauma and justice, thinking about its intersection, and thinking about how it manifests for you and how you want your relationship to be with these various identities. Hello, Margeaux, or as I feel like I want to forever now pronounce your name, Margeaux X.
You and every other automated software program out there.
Welcome to Reclaim. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. I actually don't know how I stumbled upon your Instagram. I feel like it was through a mutual friend. I want to say maybe it's Mara. I don't know if you know Mara, but I love Mara, and everything that Mara shares, I'm like obsessed with. So maybe it was something like that. Somebody I know shared something that you wrote, and I just became instantly gravitated to your work. I love your message in the world. I love the work that you do. And so thank you for doing it, because I know it's not easy, and I know it can take a toll, and I know it's all the things. But for people who
talking about trauma constantly is just like the easiest thing in the world.
I would love to hear a little bit about your story for people who are unfamiliar with you and your work in the world.
Yeah, sure. So it's so funny to have to figure out how to like summarize yourself in this way. So I tend to use a couple of descriptors to like describe myself and what I do in the world. So I'm a writer, an educator, and a community builder. Those are like the three sort of pillars of all of the work that I do in the world. I love being in community with other people. I love learning with other people. And my background is technically, and I'll be finishing this up really soon, I'm going to be finishing my PhD in English literature.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks. So wild. Still processing it. So my background, is in reading books and writing about books, and it's hard to find someone who studies literature who also doesn't write in some way, shape, or form. But story has always played such a huge role in my life from a very, very young age. I always loved reading, escaping into these worlds that were unlike my own. I grew up in like very white suburbia, in a middle-class neighborhood, but my family, and we'll talk about this because it's a huge part of my story, became poor, early in my adolescence. And so I always kind of knew that there was a lot that I was missing from where I was growing up, and that stories and novels were a place where I could learn about other humans and learn about the world. So that took me into getting this PhD in English literature. And I'm just so interested in the way that I think we're all storytellers. Mm-hmm. Every single one of us, I think people think that you have to sit down and be writing in order to be a storyteller, but we're telling stories constantly. Mm-hmm. We're telling stories at the dinner table when we're sharing our day. We're telling stories in an Instagram post. We're telling stories in policies that we create. Like, story is everywhere. And I think that there is something so powerful to telling your story. And so I think that is, a piece that comes up again and again in the work that I do, whether it's writing specifically or teaching or in community.
I love that. I love the kind of using the metaphor of story to understand and unpack our relationship with our lived experiences and the ways in which we have internalized some really difficult narratives about who we are. I love that. And one of the things that really attracted me to your work was how much you make your writing so relatable. So not only so story-like, but I can see myself easily in your story. I think that's one of your superpowers, is your ability to write in a way that a lot of people feel like they can really relate to it, and that you're almost telling their story.
And that's like the biggest compliment like you could possibly give me, because I've been so profoundly changed by other people's stories. Yeah. And, in these moments where I felt like totally alone and lost and saw someone write something and I was like, oh my God, like that's me. And it's not me because we're all different, but like, seeing yourself reflected is like life changing.
Yeah.
And it feels like such a deep honor for me. Like when I started sharing my writing on Instagram, I had no idea that it was going to resonate with folks
Yeah.
in the way that it has. And it still kind of continues to astound me. And maybe that's some like internalized imposter syndrome. But it's such a gift.
Yeah. So what what inspired you or propelled you to talk about trauma as openly as you have? Because it's one thing to, be writing stories about your life. It's another to go into the valley of death and talk about it as openly as you have.
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes back to this piece, and I would never say that writers or artists who live with trauma have any obligation to share their story with other people. I think like you making that choice needs to be about supporting you and understanding that your story is a gift that you are offering to other people. But I think for me, it felt like I had to.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like when I started to really write, I was starting to write about trauma because I needed a way to process what was coming up for me. Because I mean, I've lived with trauma like most of my life. My mom died when I was 11, and that sort of started this like domino effect of traumas that have like accumulated. And I'm now 35, just to like give some context. So there's a lot of trauma there, but I never really acknowledged it as trauma. And I think in part because of the very narrow definitions of trauma that we've been given, where it's
Yes.
like, trauma is this like you go to war or, you did,
No, that's it. That's it.
yeah,
That's
I mean, and that's where like so much of like trauma studies like really like actually like blossomed was in studying folks who had gone to war. But I mean, originally the studies around hysteria were focused on women who had been sexually assaulted. Like that's where our first understanding of trauma really come from. And at that point, like, I mean, I have sexual assault history, but I hadn't fully acknowledged it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I thought, for me was trauma was never really talked about as trauma. And
Yeah.
so I spent so much of my life like carrying around this like, gigantic list of awful things, not really knowing what it was. And so when I started trauma therapy about 4 years ago now, I just felt called to write. I felt like, I would have these like just mind-blowing therapy sessions, and like I just needed to process it further. So I would just write, and I never really thought about sharing it with anyone. And then I don't know what like propelled me to make that choice, because it's like basically one of the scariest things I've ever done.
Yeah.
Is be like, hi, here's like my trauma for you.
Yeah.
Already it's just vulnerable to be a writer who shares their writing.
Mm-hmm.
And then like, let's add this additional layer. But there was something like, as soon as I started sharing and people were responding, it was so like, I just felt so validated.
Yeah.
Felt like, oh my God, this like 20 years that I've lived with all of this and gaslit myself and validated myself, had institutions invalidate me. And now people are reading this and they're saying like, oh my goodness, like me too, or I see myself in that. And so from there, it just sort of became something that I felt I just had to do, and felt really nourished by, surprisingly.
Yeah. I think it's really important to highlight what you said, that, trauma, we often miss it if we are looking at it from the lens of a very narrow definition of what our culture kind of determines is the definition of trauma. For me, I openly share my story of, I was born in Brazil. I moved to Japan for a couple years when I was a little girl, moved back to Brazil, and then I moved to the United States when I was 7. So, and I share that, and people, I think, tend to see a lot of privilege, fair. They also tend to see like, oh, wow, well, worldly travel. It's like, that's amazing. Exotic, Brazilian, right? And that's how I then saw myself for most of my life until just the past few years of starting to untangle. Actually, there was so little support for me in these cataclysmic huge moves. I mean, a child can be traumatized moving to a different neighborhood in the same town. I was moved into a different language, different culture, vastly different cultures, right? Brazil, Japan, United States, vastly different cultures. Anyway, so it's really important, I think, for all of us to be giving ourselves permission to untangle from what the definition of trauma is and to really focus on the impact of those events on our lives and how it landed in our nervous system, and use that as the barometer and metric for what trauma is for us.
110 million%. Yeah, I think that, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about my issues with like the DSM and like having
the most perfect book. I don't know what you're talking
about. No problematic history there whatsoever.
Nothing. That's great.
But, yeah, we have this like, holy Bible that's like tells us that like complex trauma doesn't exist. Like that's not in the DSM. And like people like Judith Herman, who's like one of the most important like trauma specialists, like has been fighting since the 80s to get the DSM to include complex trauma. And so, we literally don't like, it's only, I think for me, I've seen in the past couple of years that we're starting to have this much more nuanced and expansive understanding of trauma, where it's not about like the event, it's about our body's response to the event. It's about like, whether we had the support in place to help us navigate an event. So when I'm often teaching about trauma, like I use a personal example, which is like when my mom died and I was 11, my family didn't do any grief work. We didn't do like, I honestly didn't even know the date of her death until I was in my 30s and was finally like, wow, I probably have some grief there to process and I should figure this out. So
have you been able to pinpoint at all? This is like getting really into a tangent, but just out of curiosity, have you been able to pinpoint, like once you learned the date, have you been able to track back all the years of that date and like what happened on those dates? I wonder if you would find patterns of like unconscious acting out behaviors around that date, even though you didn't consciously know what the date was.
Really basically from like, I would say 12 or 13 onwards, my whole existence was acting out. So it would be, and I always like, I knew it was around like the end of October because like after she died, we went away and it was like around Halloween. So like, I remember that. But and to be honest, like so much like, of those years of my life, because I was reflecting back this year on turning 35 and trying to remember my birthdays from it being a teenager. And I don't remember a single one. Mm-hmm. So there's like,
so clearly they were spectacular birthdays.
I mean, yeah, obviously part of me was like, probably weren't that great, or else maybe you would have remembered that. But it was just like so much dissociation was like, that was just like my daily existence. Right. So anyways, like after her death, there was no support. My brother and I didn't do like grief counseling. There was, my dad was not great at accepting support from the community. So it was like a really isolated experience, and one that was deeply traumatic.
Yeah.
Whereas like fast forward to me being 32, which is when my dad died, that event wasn't traumatic because I had community.
Yeah.
I had therapy. I had like all of these supports in place that, made his death like really sad, and there was grief, but there wasn't trauma.
Right.
And so, I just think it's always so important to like recognize, and this is why community is such a huge piece of everything I do, if we don't have support after experiencing something that has overwhelmed us, it becomes trauma.
Yeah.
And community can be this way to stop that from actually happening.
Yeah. I love that. And I think, one of the things that I see with you that I think isn't often talked about, and I think that we're really missing something, is the physical manifestation of trauma, right? We are just now, I think, starting to talk about the emotional impact, but trauma, also has very much a physical element to it and can often manifest in physical symptoms. And I would love to hear a little bit about what that has been like for you.
Whew, yeah. So it's been wild. So I started therapy in my early 20s. And when I started, it was I'd been given the diagnosis of like severe chronic anxiety and a panic disorder, which are experiences that I can trace like all the way back to like through my adolescence.
It's really interesting because I'm trained as a psychotherapist, and when you say that to me, that tells me nothing. You know what I mean? Like, it's so interesting how like we are supposed to be using these labels as something that's supposed to be helpful. Like, now knowing that you were diagnosed with panic disorder, I'm supposed to like now know certain things about you, and like, no, the truth is that means literally nothing. Don't know what that means or how that manifests. You. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah, right. So those were the diagnoses I had. So I was always, because like, anxiety is just something you feel in your body.
Yeah.
I was always aware, of its presence, and I would, describe it as like feeling like there's two bricks placed upon my lungs. Like I literally, and I was just having this conversation with someone on my Instagram, like most recent post, because I was talking about our freeze response, and we were talking about like learning what it meant to take like a deep belly breath. I literally had to take a 6-week breathwork course because I could not take a deep breath. So those like bodily symptoms like had always existed. But what really shifted was in the summer of 2016, I got really sick. And I had actually been sick like for a while before that. Like, I had a UTI followed directly by like a sinus infection, followed by a kidney infection, followed by like just a whole string. For like 6 months, I was just sick. And then one day I woke up and I couldn't make dinner without feeling like I had lost my breath. I was exhausted. I was like sleeping, 14, 16 hours a night and having to nap throughout the day. My body was just done. And right around that time, there was this brief moment of reprieve, and where I'd gone on this research trip to New Orleans, and I guess my body was like, we'll give you a break so that you can like do this thing. And I came back and dissociation hit and chronic pain hit simultaneously. Suddenly it just felt like every day, like my body was just in pain. And so it was like I had done the most intense gym workout of my life and like come down with the season's worst flu. And it was just like incapacitating a lot of the time. So at that point I was like, all right, I got to start figuring out what's going on here. And it would take a couple of years of tests and like a million different specialists before I would get a fibromyalgia diagnosis.
Which is such a frustrating diagnosis.
I mean, it's, I've been very lucky with it because I've had like doctors who actually believe it. Whereas, I mean, in some ways it's this catch-all diagnosis that people like largely disproportionately women or like assigned female at birth folks have when there's like no other like diagnosis that can be given for chronic pain. There's like fibro. But for folks who like don't know, what was like really interesting as I started to learn about fibro was that it is inextricably linked to our nervous system. The main hypothesis at this point is that it starts with like with like sleep problems. And I've spent my whole life thinking it was totally normal that I would wake up 3 to 4 times during the night to pee. Until one day my doctor was like, I don't know if like that's actually what's happening. I don't actually know if that's your bladder. And then I started to learn about the nervous system, and I was like, oh, whoa, wait, this is my flight response coming online, trying to make sure I'm safe. So it's waking me up constantly. It's just being like, are you okay? Are you all right? Is everything okay? And that just sets off this chain reaction that leads to chronic pain. So, you know, to me, like, so it's now been like, you know, 3, almost 4 years since that series of illnesses kind of started and then culminated in fibro. But yeah, so if I talk about trauma, it's kind of impossible for me to not talk about the body.
Yeah.
Because at this point, when like dissociation was finally coming onto the scene, I didn't have a language for it. I didn't know why I felt outside of my body. I didn't know why I always felt like I was about to cry. I knew what anxiety felt like. I knew what paranoia felt like, but I didn't know this. And so at that point, it became clear that I needed some body-based form of therapy.
Right.
And that's when I found a somatic therapist, and it has literally changed my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, this intersection is really interesting for a multitude of reasons, which I know that you are much more, I mean, that, you know, you, I'm sure, have also can agree with me, is that on the one hand, there's something so tremendously healing about naming the connection between the mind and the body. But then there's also something really inherently frustrating in that, because it's like, well, then how do I heal the body through the mind? And I think it can get it's very easy for culture and ourselves to then judge ourselves as somehow having, like, this is our fault, right? Like if a disease were to attack us, then we can more readily say, okay, it was the disease's fault. But when we're attacking ourselves, like an autoimmune, you know, or chronic pain or fibro, something like that, it's very easy for other people and for ourselves to be like, this is my fault. I've created this. I should be meditating more. If I only had, you know, had a more healthier wellness regimen, if I only, you know, took my mental health more seriously, if I only meditated more, then this wouldn't happen to me. And it's very easy for us to take that responsibility on because of that interconnectedness.
Well, and this is why talking about trauma as a systemic issue is so, so important.
Yeah.
Because when I think about my trauma, so if my body pain is caused by 2 decades of living with unprocessed trauma, and I start to look at all of my trauma, what do I see? I see, oh, you know, sexual assault. Well, that happened not because I was like looking for it or deserved it. It happened because of misogyny and rape culture.
Sure.
And, you know, if I look at, you know, the emotional abuse and gaslighting I experienced growing up from both my dad and my brother, I'm able to look at that and be like, oh, patriarchy. Like, you know, and I mean, I'm a white, you know, cis, like straight passing woman. And so I have a lot of privilege that's like not even bringing in, you know, what like living with racialized trauma looks like. And so I think for me, understanding trauma as a political issue has helped me significantly not feel like this is my fault. Because I will tell you, I was doing yoga daily, on meds. I eat well. Like, you know, I was checking off all the boxes, and none of those things were enough for me to not still feel trauma in my body. It just wasn't. So, you know, my hope, you know, for anyone who might be listening to this, who it really feels that like, this is my fault, just want to be like, that's not your fault. It just really, really isn't. And, you know, we live in a world that is traumatizing, and we live in a world that is not trauma informed.
Yeah.
And both of those forces have such a huge impact on our ability to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I obviously couldn't agree more. And it can be really hard when we're navigating some chronic stuff that doesn't have a diagnosis or doesn't have a treatment plan or doesn't have an answer yet. And to have to have a feeling that there's something wrong, but then to be told, that it's probably in your head, right? Or that you just need to go to therapy. It's just, it's a misuse of this burgeoning or this kind of novel, it seems like, idea that the mind and the body is connected. It has always been that way. I think we're just realizing how connected they are. And so I think it's being misused to then say, oh, you're experiencing some sort of physical thing. It's probably in your mind, and I'm really excited that there's a Netflix documentary or docuseries coming out in, I want to say, in the coming weeks. So probably when this interview goes live, it's going to be already out. So I can't attest to it yet, but I'm really interested to see. It's called Unwell. Have you heard of this?
No.
Investigating all these wellness modalities and looking at, is it really creating wellness? Like essential oils, like there is so much about the wellness industry that is like morally superior. And the docuseries, from what I understand, is meant to like investigate, but is it really delivering the results? And I think that the answer is what they're going to find is that it's complicated. It can be helpful for some, but I think we're really missing the trauma piece to it. And that we can't just expect handling our body in and of itself, that's going to completely eradicate the capacity or the ability for trauma to occur. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like what you've touched on is this like really annoying paradox that I want to like come back to for a second, because there's like two really like great pieces of like what you just said there that I want to talk about. But yeah, that first piece of sort of being like the ways in which like chronic illness and autoimmune diseases are dismissed as essentially like hysteria.
Right.
Which in some ways, like, and I'm very invested in reclaiming hysteria. Like that's like my whole dissertation is about the hysteric and how amazing she is. So, I really like identify with the hysteric because, what she was experiencing was totally real. She was just gaslit by the world. But, so there's like one way of being like, oh, it's just all in your head, like go to therapy, that can be dismissive. And then there's a different way of looking at it, where we have folks like Gabor Mate or Bessel van der Kolk, or like, folks who are pioneering this research who are saying like, no, actually, like the mind body, like you can't disconnect them. And so there probably is stuff that's happening on a mental, like, unconscious level that needs to be addressed. And also, and like for me, it's always an and also. It's like I'm in therapy, and I also know that I have a chronic pain condition that is linked to inflammation. And so likely if I cut out gluten, dairy, like, all of these things from my diet, I would probably feel better. And so there's like, it's that both and piece. We can't just go to being like, oh, well, if you just work out all the time and you're doing X, Y, and Z, because in some ways what we're actually promoting is keep yourself so busy that you don't even realize that you're like navigating trauma in your body on a regular basis. And then, so then the other piece is sort of, very interesting to me. And as I have been, I guess, kind of coming into this Instagram universe of like mental health and wellness.
Welcome to the wild, wild west.
It's been interesting for me to sort of look at, and I'd made a post like many, many, many months ago, sort of looking at liberal health approaches. And because I think we talk a lot about like, here's like the conservative sort of like approach, which is like the DSM, like is the Bible, let's like put you in a psych ward, like that's the way to like cure you. And then there's like the radical approach, but we don't often. And I think now I'm seeing more people talking about this middle space of like the more like liberal sort of approach, which often looks like spiritual bypassing, which often looks like, let me sell you X, Y, and Z million products so that you can like feel happier. And sort of there like might be like little sprinkles of social justice in there. But it's actually in a lot of ways just repeating and perpetuating that link between capitalism and like the medical industrial complex. And so my sort of stance on it with folks is I'm just like, if something that you're doing is making you feel better, who the fuck cares about the science behind it? Like, just put that lavender essential oil on your wrists all the time. If that's making you feel better, great.
Yeah.
And that's like really important to honor and celebrate what works for people. And so I guess like my own concern is sort of like, critique sort of reaches this limit where suddenly we're just feeling bad about everything that we're doing and questioning everything that we're doing. And so I'm curious, like with this show, which sounds like it has like, like this critical investigative, like, let's unpack this like industry. I hope that folks are still able to like look at that and be like, well, you know what? Doing that thing really works for me. It makes me feel good.
Yeah, I hope it's not coming from a lens of it not being open-minded, because, I do think that there is truth in everything, but nothing is true. It's just like there's like anything can be useful, and it really depends on the individual, and it depends on the intersection between their culture and their lived experience. But I have also seen how much the wellness industry is literally is just a facade for diet culture, right? It's just a facade for fat, for fat phobia. And so it's also something that I've been aware of. It's like, how can we promote wellness without it feeding into health being a moral obligation to each other?
Well, and this is why I actually never use the word healthy.
Yeah.
I just don't use it because as someone who's chronically ill, like technically I'm not healthy.
Yeah.
And so whenever I'm seeing folks who, are talking about like mental health and, or what constitutes a healthy relationship, I'm just like, ooh, this like language makes me really uncomfortable. And, it's one part obviously because of my chronically ill body, but another part, and I have like thin privilege is like that this like language of health is so tied up in, being thin and, dismissing fat bodies, which are like so many fat bodies are like healthy actually.
Yes.
And, so these labels like aren't really serving us at all.
I've been having my own conversations about how I define health. I have a hard time using the word illness, particularly as it relates to mental illness or mental disease. I have a hard time with that language because who determines that is illness? Like what is the metric of health? What is the metric of illness? Someone who is having a psychotic break, quote unquote, let's see, they're seeing things or hearing things. Who's to say that that's what's quote unquote crazy? Maybe they're just more in touch with and seeing things because things have been lifted that we have to be defended against. So it's just like what is illness? What is health? I think it's really important to be asking ourselves. I have been experiencing some health issues, quote unquote, like some chronic stuff, things that have lasted a long time, things that haven't been diagnosed. And I've been on that journey of trying to find what's going on and how to relate to my body differently. And I will say that, it is one of the most frustrating, the medical industry is one of the most frustrating things. It's like absolutely one of the most dehumanizing, frustrating things. And it's so understandable why people would hope that maybe an essential oil or yoga would work. Because to be dehumanized by a doctor, especially when you're in pain, is is a form of trauma. It can definitively hit the nervous system in a traumatic way.
Well, and and I'm always putting myself in my own context. Like I live in Canada, and so my access to healthcare is just radically different. Like, the average amount of time to get any sort of autoimmune disease diagnosis in the US is like 7 years. And that's not just because doctors don't understand autoimmune diseases, because they don't really study them, because most of the people who experience them are women. That's a whole other thing. But it's also because the literal cost. Like, I never had to think to myself, how am I going to afford to go and get this round of blood work done?
Yeah.
How am I going to afford to see this specialist? And I'm like a poor person, and so many folks living with trauma, living with chronic illness are poor because work does not look the same for us. And government support is a joke. So you're already, there's so many barriers there just at the very beginning. And, for me, even, the process of it taking 3 years, a lot of that was just like me having to kind of, I don't want to say like heal from because most of what I experienced wasn't like traumatic in terms of like the tests I had to have and whatever. I was, again, very lucky that I had a team of doctors who believed me. Mm-hmm. And we were just like, okay, so that one came back negative. Let's go for this one. But, this other piece that I always was having to navigate was having to divulge my trauma history. Mm-hmm. And that to me is like its own, like I kind of call it intake trauma. Like after having to sit there and fill out a form and check all these boxes and be like, wow, look how fucked up I am. I would take like a while before I felt like I actually had the capacity to go and do the next test. Mm-hmm.
And that's wonderful that you, I think, knew that about yourself and were able to take that space, because I think a lot of people don't know that about themselves, and then they put themselves in really uncomfortable situations. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember going to a neurologist, and he was asking me a lot of questions, and he was like, "Do you have anxiety?" And I'm a coach. I'm a psychotherapy. I'm like, doesn't everybody have anxiety, right? Like, I have yet to meet a single person in the entire world that doesn't have anxiety about something somewhere. You know what I mean? Like, it's a silly question. Like, do you have, like, everyone has anxiety? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I said that. I was like, of course I have anxiety. Doesn't everyone have anxiety? And he looked at me completely different. And I knew that he immediately thought of, oh, her physical symptoms are because of her anxiety. Like, she's not making it up, but making it up, right? Like, it's not as serious now because it probably has to do with her anxiety. And then I had to spell out, 1, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm in my own therapy, and 2, it is not, I have studied my physical symptoms. It does not flare up around points of anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I had to like preface all that. And it's like, what if I didn't know that, so it's a bummer that our doctors are so not trained or equipped to understand the complexity of the human mind, that they're so quick to then want to, label, diagnose, or categorize you as, oh, it's because of this. And now we're not going to look any further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I mean, that ability to advocate for yourself, and again, like I'm doing a PhD, like I'm like educated. I have a lot of time. Like as soon as I started getting sick, I just started finding literally any book that I could get about autoimmune diseases, and was doing all of this reading and had the luxury of being able to do that, which is like such a great privilege. So, even if, and I never knew who these specialists were going to be that I was going to see, but even if someone came back to me with some bullshit, I knew that I could respond to that and like advocate for myself. And I have, English is my first language. So again, another layer of privilege there, where it's very easy for me to communicate. Yeah. And I'm a very assertive, fiery person. Yeah. So again, it's just when people really think like, wow, like why did it take so long for you to like get that support you needed? It's like, let's really actually break this down and look at how much physical energy, mental energy, money, advocacy, like all of these things you need to have to get yourself to a point where you can even get a diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And not to mention, like for me, I just go into fawn response, you know, and I'm like, oh, yep, yeah, it's anxiety. Yep, that's fine. Yep, whatever you want to tell me, that's fine. Yep, anything. Yep, that's fine. You're so great. You're wonderful. You're a great doctor. You're my favorite doctor. Can we be best friends? So I have to like write on my phone the questions I'm going to ask, or like I'll bring my partner, or like I have to have a game plan, because if not, then like I go into this like puppet. I go into the like little Taisi puppet where I'm like, you're the best. I believe everything you say. And then I leave and my mind clicks back on. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm still confused. I don't have answers. I don't know what's happening. I wish I had asked all these questions. And again, this is why it's so important for us to know our responses, to understand how we navigate things, because then we can set ourselves up for success.
Well, until like, yeah, I mean, I knew like when I went to Women's College Hospital in Toronto for my consult, you know, at that point, I was pretty certain I had fibro. I had done enough reading. I was like, wow, that's me. Like, you know, it was just like a reflection of myself. But I didn't know what to expect from going in there, because all of my research is reading horror stories of people having to talk to doctors. Yes. So I had my partner come with me, because I was just like, I need someone here just as a support person in case someone starts to tell me I'm crazy.
Yeah.
You know, and so I was really able to like build that in. And there was always someone who came with me to a doctor's appointment, you know, as a sort of safeguard. But like to have to do that, like we shouldn't have to do that.
I know. Well, therapists should all be trained to be trauma informed, and yet they aren't. So, I mean, there's just so many things that are wrong with the system. But what I really appreciate about how you talk about your, you know, your physical symptoms, your fibro, is that I think it's just, maybe you have better insight to this than I do, but like, I just don't see a lot of people talking about these types of things. I think even while, you know, physical, mental anxiety, depression starting to become a little bit normalized, we still don't really talk about it. So there's like this veil of like having to imagine, like pretend that we're not experiencing any type of pain in order for us to be seen as valid. And so I know that a lot of times, I know for myself, I'll just speak for myself, that oftentimes I'm timid to talk about my physical stuff because I don't have answers yet. And I don't really want no advice from anybody, you know, and I don't want to be seen in some ways as broken or imperfect, because that's what I'm afraid that I'm finding out about myself. Right. And that's been my own process of untangling my worth from my ableism, right. From my ability to, and like also navigating and confronting my mortality, my limitations, the fact that like no human body is perfect. We're all going to have some type of physical experience with our body that isn't going to be, you know, in the able category, and that doesn't make us broken or wrong. So anyway, so that's why I really appreciate you talking so openly about this, because I think it's very permission slip giving to people who tend to continue to equate their worthiness with their ability, their ableism.
Yeah, I mean, it was wild to me. So I grew up, my dad became ill within a year of my mom's death. He had a very rare form of ALS that like lasted for like 20 years. So I grew up having to, like, I thought I was like, you know, had no internalized ableism, because I was like, look, like I've been navigating the world with like a father who is disabled, like, you know, and then as soon as I got sick, it was like, ableism like punched me in the face, and suddenly I was just like, you know, I'm worthless. I, you know, am unable to be productive in the way that society has taught me to be productive. And, you know, you have to understand, like, I prided myself on my productivity because I worked, I know, wild, but like I worked full time, going to university full time, while being a caregiver to my father, while still having social relationships. Like, you know, I was that like person that people are like, I don't know how you do it all. And later, like when I had this trauma knowledge, I was like, oh my God, that was just trauma. that was just like over productivity. You know, I had like, I mean, on the one hand, I had no choice but to work full time while going to school full time. There was no other way around that. But, you know, I was so functional, like it was wild. And now, you know, like there are days where I'll work for 4 hours maybe, and I feel totally great about that. Like but it's taken a long time. And again, it's taken, you know, so much of, you know, me like learning about disability justice, reading about, you know, people doing activism around chronic illness, like forming community with other like sick babes, as I call us, you know, where we're just like each other's cheerleaders when we take a day for rest. You know, I have that constant validation in my life because folks who are sick are like most of my community. So if you don't have that and you're having to navigate being sick, it's like, yeah, you would like, not only is there the internalized ableism there, but there's no like reflection of like your worth looking different.
Right.
So, I mean, finding that community, like, I don't know if I would have been able to move through those feelings without that community. And again, that's like more of the impetus for me to like write about this stuff. Because it's like, I want people to know that they're not alone in experiencing this. In fact, like it is like it is so common. Like, you know, autoimmune diseases aren't on the rise. They're just like, people are finally understanding them, and like there's more conversation happening around them. So this idea of normal, healthy body that we've been given is actually like slowly but surely being disproven as the norm. And, you know, I think also framing rest to me as an anti-capitalist like mode of resistance has been like, pretty revolutionary, where I'm just like, all right, I'm resting. I'm saying no, fuck you to capitalism. Okay. And I mean, there's a certain, like, I'm still a poor person, but I have enough like support now that I'm, you know, I'm not ever going to have to worry about being unhoused if I like don't like, you know, do X number of hours of work a day. So there is still that privilege even in my poorness. So it's not, you know, always possible for people to be like, you know, we're seeing this with COVID, like who is it that's having to go to work? You know, Black and brown, like folks, immigrants, like people who like rest is not an option.
Right.
So yeah, it always feels important to like name that. And for me to do my own disability justice work and work in transformative justice and work in trauma so that other folks can have that access.
Yes. And I thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I'll definitely make sure to, you know, share all of your things in the show notes for people who want to follow you, support you, be in your vicinity. I mean, I recommend for everybody to be in your vicinity as much as possible. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I feel very nourished.
Oh, good.
It's always like just so good for me to talk to other folks who are thinking about the same kinds of things. So I encourage folks to like come and follow me on Instagram and join in on conversations that I'm having there with other trauma BBs. And, you know, and the more community we keep building, the more powerful we're going to be. So
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Margeaux.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Guy and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.